required to just speak up in the random volunteer, but yeah, okay, messages are recording. Oh, was that a notification that just says they're being recorded now?
Yeah.
I turned off the recording during the break. So the first set of questions were, so any questions that came over the break, I can copy and paste that text to make sure it's captured.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, if I'm not calling on you or you're not getting a word in edgewise and want to just indicate that you would like a chance to speak and maybe topic it's on or something, we'll try to do that. I'm having fun moderating, but this is easiest on me the more people just jump in and volunteer with things. Okay, so I do have a plan to, it's the 7:46 or whatever time it is. We should get started again. I have a couple more ideas for questions. I want to ask the kind of like governance-y, like what's your view of the ideal role for the MGRC in terms of its interaction with the community, its interaction with ECC or Zcash Foundation or anything else really. I kind of want to time bound that and not spend more than 25 minutes or so on that. And I think that I will try to direct such question because I know that I'm going to just try to group it all into one meta question. I think on the other live streams, each candidate got to respond to either one or more specific questions like that. This will just be grouped together. So among the 4 new candidates to this live stream, Lazek, Sandy, Dan, and mine Zcash, would you, at your discretion, like to react to that kind of broad question on like, what do you think about the kind of governance role of MGRC? Like, do you have an idea of how you think it best should operate? Do you think that it has some implied obligations to interact with the community or get community input in a certain way? Do you have a view of what would be its interaction with other organizations that are already working on Zcash? It's broadly scoped. The question that I have in mind, let me try to call on you in order. Back like we did a little earlier. So, Lazek, you want to react to that?
Yes, I've commented that on the forums probably more than anything in my apprehension to view the MGRC as a body unto itself. I read ZIP 1014 as a review committee. I've repeated myself on the forums, I apologize. But I'm happy to see the recent post from the foundation providing nominal compensation at a $5 or 5 hours a month sort of estimate. Now, while I spend probably, I don't know, 30 hours a month just perusing these sorts of related developments, just for fun, I think the idea that that is nominal compensation lends to the strict interpretation of the review committee as reviewing simply proposals and not having a full expansive obligation to act on behalf or for the community, but for simply just, again, serving as that check on making sure that the foundation just doesn't spend this 8% and additionally creating a mine, for the benefit of what the community might view as insiders. That's the purpose of this, and I'm glad to see it. So that's how I view the review committee. I do think that a review committee member, however, should be open to receiving grant ideas, but anyone who's actually seeking a grant would, of course, know where to apply, and that's to the foundation, which would then pass down to the MGRC. That's it.
Sure, perfect. Sandy, do you want to react to this question about the role of MGRC or maybe organizationally how it fits into what you understand of the Zcash community?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think any governance body like the one that is being formed now, at the end of the day, is answering to the community that it serves, right? So in that capacity, I see this body as, kind of the hands that are going to be looking at and working with the community to create something like a remit so that there's like clear understanding of like, what are the needs that the community has and what is the direction. Like, right now, even during this call, there are a lot of trends that I noticed. So it's really about creating those infrastructures and protocols that are going to ensure that the governance body is behaving or acting in the best interest of the community, while at the same time, I'm assuming you're also looking for a diversity of experts that can bring in fresh knowledge or fresh expertise to help grow the community in different directions. So in that regard, reading applications is not the most interesting thing in the world, right? So somebody has to do that busy work, but I think you can do that busy work in a way that is as flat as possible or as inclusive as possible of voices that are not in the room, while still looking at the future and really new communities that you're trying to reach. So yeah.
Perfect. Dan, you want to respond?
Sure. Yeah, I could say something real quick. I definitely think that, in my opinion, one of the largest obligations of the MGRC should be to the community, as the previous two people had touched on there. But I think it should be reflective of the community's vision and not just the vision of the individual committee members or even all the committee members as a whole. Because with only 5 positions, I'd say it's quite imperative that those 5 people broadly represent the community at large.
Awesome. And Zcash?
Yeah. So when I first read Zip 1014, I was on the side of LawZeek, where I really thought that it was going to be more of a just like a review and a checks and balances on what the Zcash Foundation is doing. I mean, what we did, I took part in the previous 2 rounds of major grants in 2017 and 2018, I believe it was. Or, yeah, 2017, 2018. And that was more of an academic style review process where you got together with the other reviewers. You took each reviewer kind of assigned themselves a grant that was applying. You said, okay, how can we divvy up the work amongst ourselves, working together, and then we each did a deep dive and then provided feedback, working together on a form. However, there is some merit, I think, to the idea that the MGRC should be more active, and rather than just sitting back and waiting for people to bring stuff in and say, hey, this is something I'd like to do for Zcash, but there has to be a way for the MGRC to be more active, and the key is how to balance the outreach for new developers while the committee itself remains impartial. That's where I like in my application, I had suggested like bug bounty style system wish list, to post projects that somebody can come in, but just we have to be careful that the MGRC members don't become their own directors where to bring up conflicts of interest. And as far as how the MGRC can and it should be accountable to the community, I think one of the things that I had suggested on my application was having an MGRC make use of the community advisory panel, the forums also, and even just providing active feedback and active updates on the forums will help the community feel comfortable with what the MGRC is doing. So, but yeah, so hopefully, I don't see the MGRC necessarily needing to use the cap for every single question of where they're spending money or how they're doing it, because at the end of the day, I think the 5 people should be able to act more independently, but also take advantage of stuff that, like especially when it comes to interpretation of ZIP 1014. I mean, there's some things that are somewhat ambiguous, and I think that should not be necessarily something that the MGRC has the power to write or rewrite, and that's where the community really needs to have the input of whether it's through the CAP process or some sort of other sort of polling to say, okay, or the MGRC could propose something and say, this is what we would like to do, and then put it to a vote and ratify it somehow that way. So, but yeah.
Perfect, I appreciate that. I'm a little debating where to go. I feel like I feel like if I asked a more like governance-y kind of question as a follow-on, we might go for a little while on that. Let me phrase it this way. Yeah, okay, so if I make this question sort of more broadly, let me give a framing for this, and then maybe this will stir up a discussion from among these 4 new candidates on this call. I think that Zcash is, I find blockchain governance very interesting. I'm wary of the potential of focusing too much on building a bureaucracy and making a governance coin when I think the values of privacy and economic inclusion and a lot of other ones are stronger than governance for its own sake. That said, I think that all of us contributing to the community consider it important to try to do a good job of setting up healthy structures for governance. I think Zcash has already done, I think, pretty pioneering work in trying to make healthy structures for decentralized organization of the cryptocurrency. And I think that this MGRC committee, really follows as another experimental feature. There's no other cryptocurrency that has an MGRC. I'm not sure that this structure has exactly been tried out in any other forms. So that is and I think it's absolutely true that the first people elected to the MGRC are going to be absolutely essential in shaping what the MGRC even is. Maybe whatever you folks who get elected decide to do may end up lasting for several years and kind of shaping what follows. So I mean, with that in mind, and again, hoping to scope, discussions about governance to this, and even I don't even want to go and just call on everyone in order again, but among the 4 of you, Wazek, Sandy, Dan, and mine Zcash, do any of you want to say any more in kind of reaction to that? Like, where do you see the governance role of MGRC and how it fits into, the community organization challenges that cryptocurrencies face?
Lawzek, I guess. So again, I see it as first a democratic check, but it's I see it as a fiscal arm. And I also see it, I don't want to say as a gimmick, but it does provide the community more, it's more integrity, there's more integrity because of the democratic nature or the community's ability to check what the foundation is doing, rather than a top-down structure of any other chain hierarchy that exists. And I think that in itself, that community, it will result in a larger community once there's more involvement because of that simple ability to check what your foundation is doing, which is not available. That's where that is. But what also is this MGRC offers is this is the opportunity for the community to really demonstrate its core values through who it elects, because these are the people that are going to be closest with the community voters, or supposedly so. And those people will be able to demonstrate more clearly where the efforts of the community are going to go. That's it.
Perfect. The other 3 of you, anyone want to respond to that broadly framed question about where MGRC fits into the world of cryptocurrency governance?
And the question is specifically for the Zcash community, right? Not the broader community. Is that correct?
don't even know how best to interpret that. I mean, I guess what I would say is the scope is about, I am most interested in like the role that MGRC plays in this. But if this can be about what MGRC, you know, in terms of its structure, what it would, yeah, I don't know how to frame that question better. Let's say you can interpret the scope of it, which either one of those you prefer.
And it's open to anyone?
I'll tell you what, let me give the 4 ones the chance first, and then happy to leave that open as long as they stay within the 25 minutes governance rabbit hole time box. Sandy, did you want to react to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that especially since it's kind of the first time that this is being formed, I think that the governing body is really going to have to do a lot of homework in terms of writing down like a lot of the busy work of writing down what are the values that this community upholds, what are the goals, the short-term goals and long-term goals, establishing feedback loops, right? Establishing strong communication channels, also understanding the role that Zcash has in the broader, that's why I was asking you about the broader community, because, you know, I don't think it's a surprise that cryptocurrency, you know, doesn't necessarily always have the best reputation, right? And so I think this is an opportunity for the Zcash community, especially to kind of show true leadership in the field and show like the impact and the growth and the value added that this can provide society in a very transparent and kind of collaborative way. So I think it's not just about like the Zcash community, it's really about what is the direction of this field, what is the direction of this space, and what are the values, and also like the literally the simple like systems in place that you want to establish in order so that like, you know, the community's vision or value system, it's constantly being pumped into what you guys are doing, right? I mean, forums are great, but forums do not make strategy, nor do they are they very good at kind of creating a long-term plan, right? So that's kind of like what I see.
Do you have some, I feel like you're suggesting that there's like a certain form of like public communication or writing down that we could do, whether it's like a codifying of values, like a constitution or something, or some kind of targeted strategic material. As you made the point of reference, like we have lots of blog posts explaining our viewpoints, and forums clearly have lots of discussion. At the Zcash Foundation, we have like a values document. I think Hudson's referred to it in one of the live streams. And I think what you're suggesting is like strategic writing or something. Is that kind of what you have in mind?
I'm suggesting the strategic creation of tools that are collaborative and are pushing the field itself into a particular direction, number one, right? And that could be anything from like industry standards, right? To, you know, principles of like, you know, a value system, right? But also, it's really, really important to kind of also determine by acting what you preach or doing what you preach, right? So I see this governance body as really having an opportunity to really show the impact that, you know, this technology can have in the world. Illustrated, tell, you know, somebody was talking about storytelling, tell the stories, right, of like what you're funding and how this is impacting the world and why this is a good thing, and like build trust and transparency, not just with your community, but the community outside of Zcash, right? Because there, again, going back to the barrier of entry, there's barriers of entry, and the best way is to basically, like, if you're already going to spend the money to invest in these projects, then tell the story so that you can also push the field and the general public into kind of like seeing the value added that this has in their life and the potential it has in their life, you know? So yeah, it's creation of tools, and also like, again, I say feedback loops and communication tools, but really they're just like ways to ensure that the governing body constantly is in communication with the folks that they serve, and whatever strategy that they're adapting makes sense, right? That it's not just like a pie in the sky, that it's really grounded in reality.
Awesome, thank you. Dawn, Dan, or Sean, either of you want to react to anything governance related as broadly as you like.
Yeah, again, I'll just keep it short. I think because no other crypto project has anything like the MGRC or a dev fund that is baked into the block rewards, I think the MGRC, it could be a great opportunity to show the strength and benefits of having something like this and what can be done with it to grow the ecosystem.
Awesome. Sean, if I call on you, given that the other three do it, you want to give a react to it?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I think we definitely need to have the MGRC sit down, and that's really what the initial group is about. I think it's about getting the conflict of interest policies hammered out, ethics policies, communication channels, and like even just simple stuff like, okay, are we going to call ourselves MGRC forever, or should we come up with a better name for it? And I think we should probably come up with a better name for it personally, so to differentiate it and more associate it with Zcash. But the Zcash Foundation, as you know, already has quite a few of those kind of conflict of interest policies, and I'd like to see some of those adapted. And hopefully we can use those as kind of like a baseline, but the MGRC should be able to stand on its own and have its own way of doing things that's not necessarily the exact same way that the ECC or the foundation would approach it. So, yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so I'd like to relay Dara's question. Maybe this will be the last question we do in this rotate through the same four pattern. And I'm going to interpret it merging with another question as kind of grants in the big versus the small. So this question is like, do you imagine it's more likely we would see lots of little grants, or would the opportunity of the MGRC to make, say, one very large grant, which I think is technically allowed under the ZIP and hasn't been ruled out by other norms or whatever I think we've discussed so far. Would you reject a grant that was very large? Is there a moonshot grant that you think you would consider picking, even if it exhausted the entire budget and remit of the MGRC? Hopefully that question is framed in some way that's useful. We do it by U4 or by volunteering in any order of your choice.
I guess I'll go for it first. Lozak, I'm enticed by the opportunity for a single grant to be the entire 1,100 ZEC a day that's offered to this review committee. Again, that would first have to pass down from the foundation as I read the ZIP. But again, as I said just in the last question, this is where the community's elected representatives on this review committee, that's when the values start to actually shine. I understand that it can be, rather than the one and done grant, it would be safer to go with these small grants. But if the way that, and since this is the last question, I'm going to try to give it my pitch. The way where I see our digital chains, governance, whatever you want to call them, these days is the world is going to come to us because the institutions that exist right now are on the way out. I think that the brilliant work that the people on this call have already done, like Zcash VR has said, the on-chain privacy, as Nathan Holmes has said, it's a waiting game, and to me, it's what can we do to accelerate our position relative to other chains. And I would like, if there were a proposal that that does seek to interact with, the normal consumer who's just the normal app-based user, and started having him use these permission-based blockchains to access new ways of interacting commercially. Again, like the new land use cases with communal living. I already addressed that. There's other things that like that require that sort of capital. I would go for it, but I assume that the MGRC will deliberate and not just simply be voting. Of course, that's what the meetings are for. And you would use the time in the meetings to discuss the pros and cons. And some of the things that I would think the first thing that the MGRC should do is, because we want to move slowly but confidently, the only thing that I think that is out there that is an unresolved issue are the time periods in which the MGRC makes decisions. So putting like a 3-month delay or a 2-month delay on voting for reassessment of these grants, these proposals within the MGRC is, I think, the only thing that's actually left to be determined by the ZIP in how we go about voting. I think that pretty much covers everything I want to talk about. Thanks.
Okay. All right, Sean, Sandy, or Dan, you want to react to?
Just a technical correction. The amount of the reward available to MGRC is 288 SEK per day.
I think you gave a number like 1,100 or something per day.
Yeah, I'm sorry. We're the 1,100. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. It's 1,100 block rewards a day. I apologize. 1,152.
That's all right. The blockchain will keep track of it for us.
Yeah, thanks.
The question that was posed was that was about putting all your rewards for possibly one cycle or one
yeah, that's roughly
period.
The scope of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I don't personally see a way that would meet all the diverse needs of the community if you put all your eggs in one basket in that regard. I mean, there's so many ways that we can help drive Zcash adoption, from education to mobile wallets, and just even helping out the core or augmenting the workflows from the foundation and the ECC's work streams to see if we can fill in the gaps that they may be seeing. So yeah, I personally don't see a scenario where one single project would be worth the entire pot for growing the community. But again, just my personal opinion.
Do you have any kind of finer grained view then on, if not one, like, where on the spectrum would you kind of fall in terms of your either ideal case or maybe bounds that you would set in terms of like 100 tiny grants, or like a few still fairly large ones, but still not technically all your eggs in two baskets? It'd be all your eggs in. I think I get that one.
I certainly see a case where, I mean, a very large portion can go to somewhere where it's if it's like say you're hiring, this team, it works really well together, that they've delivered these big projects before. I could see, yes, let's go ahead and spend a full month's worth of Zeke or whatever arbitrary amount on this particular one thing that we know will help grow the ecosystem. But as far as the, personally, I'd like to see it delegated and out a little bit further to try to disperse the wealth to more developers and more ecosystem contributors.
Sandy, I saw you agree with that via chat. Do you want to agree with it orally as well?
Sure. I completely agree, and I'll expand a little bit on that. Number one, not everybody can accept large grants, right? And if you are trying to bring in underrepresented communities, particularly underrepresented communities that are not from North America or Europe, a lot of times accepting large grants is very, very difficult, right? Also, a lot of groups can do a lot with very little, right? So I think that those are two major things. Obviously, from my perspective, the type of projects that will be funded might be very diverse, right? Because you're building a community, you're just not building tech, right? So, you know, an educational project, very much like mine Zcash said, may not require as much as a project that is really looking at the technical infrastructure and trying to improve the system on a broader scale. So in terms of both equity and also just in terms of not putting, you know, basically investing into different communities, right? Because they might be at different levels or different places in terms of their relationship. You know, with blockchain and cryptocurrency, I think it's really important to have a very like diverse kind of strategy. And I'll just mention just really quickly from my experience, just like for like the general knowledge of the community, where I come from, right? Believe it or not, fellowships were incredibly powerful to bring underrepresented communities, especially folks, because like obviously funding is very difficult. English is not your first language. It's also very difficult. There's a lot of inequality, or not inequalities, but it's as you're building the application or the process, you have to be aware of the inequities, right? Or what can produce inequity. And so fellowships were great because a lot of folks that maybe in the beginning were not ready for a larger grant, they started with a fellowship, and then a year or 2 years later, they were actually super ready for like a bigger grant and then had incredible impact. So it's really important to kind of analyze like who you're trying to serve and then look at that process. And again, going back to the governance body, that's hopefully something that this group will look at, right? These type of questions and these type of process like flags, basically.
Awesome, great points. Dan, I don't think I called on you yet for this question. You want to react to it?
Sure. Yeah. I simply just say I think there will need to be balance. I'd personally like to see a variety of smaller grants, maybe 1 or 2 larger scale ones, depending on what's being proposed. But maybe I'm thinking the best move possibly will be just waiting as well as actively searching, which I know was a question on the forums, for applicants until there is a sort of a list and we can evaluate and see how much is being asked for and what is being proposed by these applicants, and then evaluate from there based on what we see has been submitted or actively searched out.
Perfect. You four, do you have any questions that you wish that I would have asked you? I'm planning on switching pretty quickly to kind of open arms flailing format. So, but it seemed like a good way to, maybe if one of you wants to suggest a question that you wish I would have asked, then I might let the 4 of you ask it or respond to it.
I feel good. I appreciate the time I got so far since I wasn't on the other ones. So thank you guys.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just also wanted to say I appreciate you guys taking this call to give a little bit more focus on the people that hadn't joined on the ones hosted by Hudson. And thanks for the opportunity. And I'll still be, whether I'm on the MGRC or not, I'll always be here to support the community. So.
Awesome. While I'm ending the 4-person mode, it's not a goodbye. We're still going to use up the whole 40 damn minutes we have on the clock. Sandy or Lozek, do you have suggestions on questions you'd like me to ask the 4 of you?
I don't necessarily have questions that I wish I was asked, but I do have questions that I wanted to ask. And I guess the question I have is, at the end of this adventure, right, what is the outcome, right? Like, I mean, especially for the folks that are actually conducting, you know, the interviews or asking, kind of looking into the candidates, like, what is the ideal goal for them of like what this group of people is going to accomplish or what they should be? Because I don't think I have a very strong grasp yet on like some of the vision, right? Like the long-term vision.
Yeah, that's I think we're all trying to form visions in different ways. Let me try to pose the question this way, because I wanted to switch to the open questions shortly anyway. Let me interpret that as a question from the candidates to the CAP members. Is anyone who's like, I don't even say you have to be a CAP member, anyone else on the call besides the candidates, would you like to use this floor opportunity to express a vision of what you think the ideal outcome is for the MGRC at the end of this process?
Sorry, was that for the candidates or not for the candidates?
That's for even non-candidates, yeah.
So
I'd like to hear Chris start.
Sure, I'll throw something in. I really see the MGRC as an interim solution. And Placeholder has a front row seat at 5 layer 1 governance experiments that would be Bitcoin, Decred, Zcash, Ethereum, and Polkadot. And then we've got about 15 other smaller governance and crypto economic experiments. And our whole practice is built around governance and crypto economics. It's the two things that for the last 3 years we've really honed in on as being key principles to get right to allow networks to scale globally and equitably. And I think we all agree on this call that there's good progress in crypto and there's some really sad behavior as well. When I think about Zcash in this context, no one has it figured out at layer 1 yet. Bitcoin has chosen basically no governance to make it politically incorruptible, but there is a ruling elite. And I think that is hard or can be problematic down the line. On the flip side of things, you have Decred, which is 100% on-chain, coin holder based. And there are, with that level of decentralization, there are then coordination problems when you have to move quickly. And so I think that Zcash's opportunity is in this stage to be quick and coordinated because it's slightly smaller, but use that coordination speed ability right now while still smaller to be able to put in place the most robust layer 1 governance mechanism possible. And there was some conversation about this in the chat, but right now the system is pretty vulnerable to regulatory intervention of different kinds. And for what we're trying to build, that's not acceptable long term. And so part of the funds I think of the MGRC in a way is actually making displacing the MGRC eventually. One idea that I kicked around with a few people was, for example, could we fork Politeia and just have soft coin holder voting that's not binding, but basically riding alongside MGRC votes? And so it's a little bit of a trial of, okay, let's see what happens if we give Zeke holders the ability to express their opinion. And it's really just a venue to express the opinion and to know that they're being heard. And then for that track record to remain and to be mashed up against whatever MGRC decides. And then it starts to give us empirical data around, is MGRC meshing with the community? Is the community, if we were to hand over reins in this way at a future date, capable of taking on these reins and active enough? There are even really interesting things we could do where you actually take a very small percentage of what's handed to the MGRC and actually hand that to the people who vote. So then your voters earn small amounts of Zeke, and you start to allow people to earn Zeke just using their labor and time and love of Zcash. So I think there's a whole bunch of ways in which we can empower more people and get more people involved. I think some principles here, in governance, I'm kind of always thinking about the balance of rules and discretion. So we want to use rules to scale globally and rules that are transparent and hard to change, because then we can all trust them. And that allows global scale and less political game playing. But the thing to be careful of with rules is too much inflexibility, and that's where discretion comes in. But you have to be really careful with discretion. Look no further. Well, like the US over the last 4 years has been kind of a good example of a decently designed rules system facing an onslaught of discretionary chaos. And like, we'll see what happens with the US, but I use that as an example of like, we need to design a system that has good rules that can withstand discretionary chaos and still prevail. And that's like, it's a really not an easy problem when we operate in these anonymous online or pseudonymous online environments. And so I have all kinds of questions that come up about like, do we want reputation? Do we not want reputation? And I think I'm opening more questions than answers. And I think generally I'm always asking more questions than trying to throw out answers, because it's not for me specifically decide. It's more to make sure that the community is assessing all of the relevant questions, and then with all of the relevant questions and information, making the decisions to move forward. And so just to sum up here, I think the opportunity for Zcash is to really pioneer layer 1 governance done right.
I have an opinion on this.
Sure.
So to me, the role of the MGRC is to efficiently allocate the funds it has to projects that are that are likely to succeed. And obviously, you can't guarantee that, but you should spread the risk out of it, and that are complementary to what ECC and ZF are doing. We don't want to duplicate what the ECC and ZF are doing. We want to invest in projects that are going to help to fill in the gaps. And I don't really see it as being MGRC's role to invent a new governance mechanism. That should be a wider thing for the community rather than MGRC.
I would add that there's a connection between those two things, which is that I think in order to have any kind of robust governance, you need a wide range of different types of very sophisticated stakeholders. Stakeholders of different kinds, like individuals and for-profits and civil society groups, and potentially, to some degree, states or regulators, but like different kinds and radically different interests. And then you need some kind of play and tension between those different types of stakeholders. I think the American moment that you're pointing to the extent that it doesn't slide into something really bad, that's going to happen because, not just because some people wrote a really good constitution, hundreds of years ago, but because of the presence of a really sophisticated interlocking set of institutions of very different types and deliberately designed different interests. And I think the only way you can get there is to have a really, really successful project, right? Like that's not sufficient, because we can see that Bitcoin is very successful and has a ton of stakeholders and doesn't have this, although maybe it's enough, even if the mechanisms aren't right, just having enough people caring about the project gets them a lot. But I think it is necessary, because otherwise you get a lot of people, a lot of participants who don't have skin in the game, or who don't have enough enough varied senses of varied types of experience and interest in making the thing work, really bringing their whole selves to the table. And I think the tricky thing about MGRC is, like, for the people who join the MGRC, we're going to really have to care. We're going to really have to care that the funds we put out are used well, and not just used well in the sense that they didn't like mess up or flake out, but that they really contribute to some vector of making this currency really popular for effective use of privacy online, or of money with privacy online. And once that happens, we start to unlock the possibility of creating an ecosystem with a lot of this very kind of robust, varied set of stakeholders, because the thing is just too important to fail, and it's too important to not engage with for all these different stakeholders. I think that's really key.
I'd like to call on Dean next. You seemed to indicate you wanted to react, I think, to this question a little bit ago. I guess the question being, what do you have as a CAP member? What would you like to see as the ideal success and goal of the MGRC? Or if not end goal, near-term goal, anything of your choice. And because I enjoyed following the chat discussion about how you got an invite to the CAP, and it seemed like Harry just not get that, I think I would call him Harry immediately afterward. Or indeed just to listen to anything you want to say. Go ahead.
So I actually had more question than comment, or rather, early
Not very
on.
often in an open forum.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Oh, I can turn on my video. Yeah, sorry. So there, early on, ZF grants, for example, were fairly small. Is my understanding, and and apologies if I'm not quite right there. But there are some things that are well doable with small grants. There are some things that take larger grants, and I'm not talking about take all of the money and put it on one bet or something like that. But my question is, how do you, what's the size of project you guys are thinking about? What's the length of projects you guys are thinking about? I mean, there's, 5K for small prizes at a small hackathon versus building a bridge to Ethereum so you could have wrapped Zcash and a big liquidity pool or whatever it is, right? And some of those make sense to fund. Some of those are like, yeah, that looks like a company. Someone should go do that, and maybe we could help someone get off the ground, but that's not our job. And so, sort of, what's the spectrum of things that you think MGRC size-wise should be encouraging and length-wise?
Okay, I like that question. Could I frame that then, or direct it to the four new candidates on this call? So that relates a lot to the small versus large grants that we discussed. Suddenly lost my train of thought because I felt that there was an aspect of what Dean said that seemed to be a different view of that question. Maybe it was really about the length or duration. Like, do you think what do you think should be the focus that we use to set our goals? Should we be thinking like several years in the future or fairly short-term milestones?
And then I actually do have a follow-up as well.
Okay, how about any of the four new candidates among Dan, Zcash, Lozik, and Sandy react to that question? If you like, maybe this could.
So the question was specifically how much funding should go to which project?
No, how big and how long do you see grants being for, right? 3-month projects, 2-year projects, 10-year monolithic efforts.
We talked about the small versus large grants, but not really in the context of like length of time or horizon.
Well, I wouldn't. That's a tricky one because I think it really depends on who's getting the grant and the scope of the grant. So I could see something 3-month grant renewing every 6 months, but one of the tricky parts is that the MGRC is limited to a seat for 1 year. So do we try to fund grants that will be there for the next people to come sit in, or do you have it try to put in a default mechanism somehow of let's go ahead and take it or set it up, I should say, so that it has to be renewed every year. So even though it is a long-term project, maybe it has a cap on 1 year simply due to the structure of the MGRC. But yeah, that's a good question, and I'm not really sure. I think it's really dependent on the scope of the project.
Anyone else want to react to that?
Go ahead.
No. Well, I've kind of shown my cards and that I actually favor larger grants, but this would ultimately be controlled by the MGRC, and I do think that anything is worked out through the contracting essentially, and it would of course be subject to the next MGRC board. I'm not saying, I mean, you could draft in a right of revocation, but I mean a grant goes one way. You just make it renewable, and I think that would be of course the only way that you would do it. Again, I think that there is more to be lost in distributing too many small projects and lose the opportunity in what I see as a critical time to not gain the attention of a broader community through a larger effort. And I know that's traditionally going to be the role of the ECC and the ZF, But yeah, someone just said big project, little milestones. Yes, but this as a community effort. This is the community acting more as one, and if the values are right, and if a project is sufficiently large, I think that taking the smaller number of larger efforts is wise, depending on, of course, the strengths of the exact proposal. Thanks.
Okay. Sandy, it seemed like you were about to react.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think the goal is to fund projects that are going to strengthen, like create resiliency and diversify the ecosystem, right? And so those projects are going to be very, very diverse, right? Because you're talking about the entire world, right? You're not just talking about, people in New York City that do this, right? So because of that, I think the time frames are going to differ, right? If it's a critical, kind of technological architectural project, it might take longer, right? Than I don't know, a training workshop educational program, right? That might be accomplished in like 3 to 6 months. So I think like before you even discuss like what are the time frames, I think that the body has to discuss what are the products that we're offering, right? I mentioned fellowship, right? Well, there's other products, right? Are you doing one where, it's small grants to kind of see like, kind of get like test different prototypes, right? It could be like a prototype fund. Is it something that is focused on building community? Is it, there's like 100 things you can do, and whatever you determine based on the goals, based on the community feedback, based on the strategy, then you can kind of determine the time frame, and then, the minimum maximum amount of money for each of those branches or tools, I guess, or products. I hate using the word products, but that you're kind of like using, right? Because I strongly think, again, that building resiliency and diversity in the ecosystem is probably going to be the most important goal.
Perfect. Dan, you want to react to that since we heard from the other three?
Sure. Yeah. I don't have much to add apart from what I said earlier to the related question about maybe, waiting, actively searching and waiting for applicants to build a sort of list to then see what lengths are what the projects think that how much they need and how long they think it will take. And based on that list, we can evaluate from there and decide as a committee, as opposed to, let's say, setting restrictions where I would say all applications are welcome. If the MGRC prefers others over smaller ones over larger ones, or vice versa, all applications welcome, and then evaluate once there's a built up list, depending on what's available.
Awesome.
So a comment that I'd like to inject into that as a organization that has gotten some grants is a interesting slowdown in the flow of grants to the organization is if people aren't sure what the organization wants to fund. And so, is it a valid, are they doing grants that are relevant to my company? Is it big enough? Is it a subject we're good at? Not that, we're a development house, but it's one of those things where, is this a place I should reach, thinking of being a random group that's not currently in the community, because after all, part of the goal of this is to expand the community. Is that should I go there or should I go to Interchain Foundation? Should I go there or should I, even though it's a stretch, I should talk to the ECC or to the Ethereum community because I know what size their grants are, that sort of thing. And so actually carving out a space there is a part of the marketing in some sense that MGRC should do. My follow-up question is about accountability, because of course giving out money is easy. Let me assure you, receiving money is easy. Delivering on those things and having some mechanism of accountability that is fair to the people doing it is also a big filter for, A, whether it'll be effective, but also B, what kinds of organizations can do it. I've seen ones where, we will reward you on completion. Well, I got to pay my people, every week. So being rewarded, 6 months down the line in case I satisfy some hard research problem is a challenge. And so figuring out how to balance those is an interesting thing. What's the role of MGRC in that? Who is it that does that in this in that part of the ecosystem?
Do any of the candidates, whether the 4 new to this call or any of the candidates, want to react and say something about, we've had a lot of discussions about accountability in different forms, and I think accountability shows up in the text of the zip that creates the MGRC, so it's there for sure. Maybe you could react in the form of specific suggestions for, what the MGRC could do, procedurally, how it would work, that would lead to the accountability outcome you want.
I think the accountability blends together with how, with the structure of the way resources are allocated. So and this is where grants are relevant to certain projects, milestone-based grants, and big believer in, milestones that keep everyone on track, basically, exactly as Dean's saying, keep people paid who are on the grant side, so long as the milestones are being hit. And then you really need a full-time person staying on top of, the authentic accountability of milestones being hit, not just kind of whitewashing milestones being hit. Prizes are relevant in another area, and then investments are relevant. And so it's really kind of allocating the resources in the structure that makes most sense for the project that's being tackled.
The organization.
Say the last bit again. I heard the word organization, but maybe it was an echo.
It wasn't me, though.
Okay. All right. Any other candidate want to react to that question on what makes accountability work? What's a good idea for accountability the MGRC should follow?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Please go.
Okay. Yeah, I think each committee should have flexibility to drive a program that they feel that would increase the adoption of Zcash and make it more useful. But they have to fulfill the goal of the MGRC, which is to increase the usage and the number of users. So within that overarching goal, I think each committee could define a mission and design a rubric, whether it's amongst each one of the members themselves or the committee as a whole, that fulfills that mission of increasing the users and the usage. So in that way, the committee can be accountable to itself, to outsiders who are looking in, asking, what are you guys doing and why? And as they progress, they can display results in order to be accountable to that rubric and mission. And in order to, while doing all that, of course, there are items in the ZIP that are required, quarterly reports, financial statements. And so using that ZIP and that framework of defining a mission within the committee that fits, that is aligned with the MGRC overall mission, designing a rubric for the committee, and using that and displaying all the results as you fulfill your mission, I think is a simple framework to maintain transparency and accountability.
And if I may interrupt again, I apologize. If a person like Dean were to come and present a large proposal, I think the MGRC's role in this ecosystem is primarily to vote. Ultimately, the enforcement agent is the foundation. Now, the review committee should be, of course, keeping up to date on what its grantees are doing, and that's the purpose of the meetings that they have monthly. But once the review committee has voted, unless there is something that's critical, that's more than likely largely the end of the MGRC's involvement. We do not want to suggest that we're delegating this sort of authority for the MGRC to be constantly intermeddling with the recipients' grants after it's been granted. That's not what that if that were the case, I think it's setting up the MGRC for failure. If one of these 5 or more than one of the 5 members just cannot deal with butting more than they can chew. They're not liaisons. They're not integrating. Their role is voting. Thanks.
So I disagree. I think that MGRC should be responsible for doing outreach and finding teams that are qualified and capable, and then directing funds to those teams, but then also providing support to those teams. And by that, I don't mean, helping them set up their office or simple stuff like that. I mean, talking to the teams, understanding the challenges that they're wrestling with, connecting them with people that can help them solve those problems, and helping them overcome obstacles. This is something that is very common in the startup ecosystem. This is a role that good investors typically play with their portfolio companies. And I don't see MGRC being any different in that capacity. We don't want to just write a check and say, hey, we'll see you in 6 months, good luck. It needs to be, there needs to be much more connectivity for the duration of that relationship. I think that's what we're building here, are relationships to bolster the community in support of the mission. It's a long view, not a transactional view.
I would agree with what DC says. However, I wouldn't take an active part as a committee member to mentor grant recipients myself because I'm not so technical. Perhaps other members on the committee would. I would rather push the recipients back towards the Zcash Developer Alliance or the Zcash Gardening Calls or many other communal ways where they can work with other developers and work with other users rather than being an overarching presence on the progress of each grant.
If I can really quickly comment, I think that in order to ensure that your investment is going to have a good result, right? You need some type of program manager that is checking in with projects on a regular basis, right? The idea that you just give, like, let's say $100,000 and that like a year it's going to happen without check-in is not reality, right? Because that the checking in and the in-kind resources that David was talking about that VCs do, funders do that as well. That's actually part of their like primary responsibility, right? Unfortunately, that's just what happens when you're dealing with projects, right? You might have one or two projects that are so fucking amazing that boom, they'll deliver like ahead of schedule and like they'll surprise you at how good they are, but that's usually not the reality. So having a program manager, I don't know if the governing body should do that because honestly, everybody has day jobs, right? Like we have to like look at like what is actually capable or what is our capacity. But if there is a way, to invest in hiring someone that can serve as that project manager, that can answer questions, that can check in, have like monthly calls with the projects, that can, create centers of gravity so projects can support each other, that, like David said, can assist with networking, that's going to be really, really strong. It's kind of like what I was saying before, like these type of things require a lot of good research, and there's been a lot of successes and a lot of failures in both funding, like traditional funding, like a Ford Foundation, and VC funding, right? So it's really, really important that we learn from the past, even if we're creating something different. And I really do think that we just, maybe it's not the governing body, but maybe it's part of the governing body is hiring or finding someone that can serve as that individual that is, kind of handling that day-to-day work.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the other reason is that and I think this was in what Sandy was saying, but I want to like really underline it, is that the reason why you engage is not necessarily to meddle and not just to make sure that the project goes well. It's to know why it doesn't go well and to learn from the mistakes made in grant making or investing. So I think the hardest thing, especially on the nonprofit side, where you don't have kind of just ROI at the end of the day as a yardstick for measuring the efficacy of your work, is that you have to evaluate not just how well the projects are doing, right, but how well you're doing in picking projects or in supporting them. And that is really, really hard on the grant making side, because what's the yardstick, right? I mean, the payoff here will be very long term, and so I think the only real yardstick is a lot of introspection, a lot of heavy internal discussion about what to fund, and a lot of high def information coming in from looking at the projects in the spaces that they're operating in and being really ready to be critical about where they're succeeding but where they're failing, and trying to patch holes and stuff like that. I think it's and I think also this is not, we should not be reinventing the wheel here. There is a body of work on the foundation funding side. I think we should be looking at examples that have gone well and learning from those, and examples that have not gone well and trying to avoid those pitfalls. And I'm really interested in, I don't know, I'd be interested in hearing what people think about that and what people think the models are that we will want to be copying on the nonprofit side or on the VC side if the ZIP is amended to allow that.
I really love that question.
So on the
Go ahead, Dara. I was going to ask a question about what good role models there would be. But Dara, go ahead.
So on the question of technical review, I mean, not all projects will involve changes to Zcashd or Zebra, but some of them will, and those will have to be reviewed by the Zcashd engineers or the Zebra engineers. There's no getting around that. So it's external technical review that should concentrate on projects that are not involving direct changes to Zcash or Zebra. Otherwise, you're just duplicating effort.
Harry, I'd like to call on you. I had in mind the topic that I'd like to then pose to anyone who wants to respond. This is, I think, a good question, and this was some of the chat discussion during a lot of this call, is like, what are the ideal role models? So clearly some things we're doing with the organization of Zcash governance and MGRC are unique, but clearly there's a lot of interesting points of reference in cryptocurrency, open source, elsewhere we can learn from. Yeah, do you want to respond on voice?
Yeah, I can respond on voice. Just give me a second. Yeah, so in terms, I mean, just to be clear, I spent probably a decade of my life working on governance and standardization with bodies like the World Wide Web Consortium, who, run HTML on the web, and SEP law liaisoning and work with the Internet Engineering Task Force. So these are much larger bodies where there's much more money on the line and a pretty huge user base, otherwise known as everyone that uses a web browser, and most people that use TCP/IP. And UDP. Let's never. And then the danger, and I'll just tell you what I learned, and it's quite brief. There are two main flaws in any structure. One flaw, which we see in the cryptocurrency space in spades, but is not a particular problem in the cryptocurrency space. It's the problem we have, for example, with Tim Berners-Lee and the Web Consortium, or Vint Cerf and the IETF, which is that you cannot have a charismatic leader. Now, the good thing is the MGRC can correct these problems by distributing the leadership among a group of people. The second problem is a problem which is inherent to the nonprofit space. Because nonprofits, particularly as they're structured as boards, do not allow, almost by, it's very hard to fire people. It's very hard to remove people when they don't do their job. And it's very hard to prevent. And, I saw this at W3C. You spin it for, I'm sure it was super functional first few years. You spin it forward 20 years. They're working on DRM and Corona passports using random blockchains by ICOs. I mean, it's actually pathetically sad. And what causes this is the inability to fire people, to have KPIs, to basically hold people accountable to those KPIs, and also this ability to be captured by a set of interests. And this captures both internal and external. It's internal insofar as that people who are existing employees or board members or ex-charismatic leaders or senile charismatic leaders or whatever, you can't remove them, so that they essentially run the thing as their own personal set of personal projects, which is fine if you're running, if you're a professor, that's what you're paid to do. It's not fine if you are trying to implement things in web browsers. The next problem is external capture. We obviously, once Zcash becomes valuable, and the reason I'm here is because I'm bullish on privacy and very bullish on Zcash, is that and Zcash will be a component in a larger privacy platform. The external players will become more and more heavily involved, particularly when money shows up. They will try to capture large amounts of that money and influence the process, and that's very hard to prevent. And it's hard to prevent not because people are immoral, and not because maybe the rules of the charter, the constitution's not clear, or I need to do another vote. It's just due to the fact that humans are by nature, I think, ultimately corruptible, even the best of us, including myself. So I would just say that I would eventually, the DAO world is very unexplored right now. I would eventually aim more and more in that direction, and I would rotate the MGRC as frequently as lets it be functional. And I would remain as much as independent as possible and have as much friendliness to outsiders as possible. I'm an outsider. I had trouble dealing with not ECC, but with the Zcash Foundation. And to be honest, I'm very bullish on Zcash. So I'm still here. If I were a person from another community, if I were even a woman of color, if I were a non-native English speaker, if I were just someone who also had some interest in some other chains, or even didn't even care that much about cryptocurrency, but just cared about privacy, I would probably not be here. So I would really recommend that we try to open up the floor as much as possible. I would say, of all possible, do not incorporate another nonprofit. Be very careful of that model in the long run. And, try to be open to new governance changes. And because we don't really know how DAOs work in the long term, just be able to rotate and have a strong accountability process. And that accountability process has to be ran KPI style on something objective, because otherwise it screws up. And the reason why the web started working, for better or for worse, and we got HTML5 out the door in JavaScript, is not because the governance structure is functional, it's because Google started providing feedback on what was actually being used and not, and growth stats in the web. Then Google used that feedback to capture the organization. That's literally what happened with the web. That's why blockchain is big now. So you have to prevent that, because something similar will happen with Zcash if Zcash becomes big, which I do think it will. I do think it will.
Definitely.
So I want to, we don't have very many minutes left. I want to, I think, actually just carry through this question to the end of the time that we have. Anyone else want to react by explaining what role models we should be looking towards to emulate in some way in Zcash, or specifically through MGRC?
There was one that I was thinking about that I think would be really powerful, which is Gitcoin. They work with a number of, they were started with Ethereum, but they also now work with SIA and Handshake and a few others. And it's community-driven grants using cryptocurrency platforms. So if someone were to come to the MGRC and say, I want to build something that allows people to crowdfund grants with their Zcash, whether it be shielded or not, I think it would be really powerful. And there should be more grassroots stuff like that. If there's something like Gitcoin, but for Zcash, that would be really, really cool.
I have one thought to contribute. I think, not to be a contrarian, but instead of an organization to emulate, I think what we want to avoid is something like fixed political terms. I really like the idea of rotation, but maybe a different way, a way to make it even more powerful is where we do have fixed terms, because people do need some form of certainty. But we should have, and I put this in one of my posts somewhere, we should have an elegant way to retire somebody, so that at all times people are pulling weight. And if somebody is pulling way too far away from reasonable, there's a way to fix that without waiting for the end of the term or end of the rotation. I think all of us have experienced saying yes to hiring somebody, but then realizing on their first week of the job that they're just a really bad fit. So I think the ability to do that in a way that is not socially unacceptable will lead to the highest performing MGRC over a long time.
Totally sharp suggestion.
Almost done.
Go ahead. You want to, Sandra?
Oh, my husband came in. I was just telling him we're almost on the call. I'm sorry.
No, I'm on a live stream. Okay.
Hey guys, my name is not actually listed with my picture, so I just wanted to mention that I am a candidate, and my name is James Joseph. And thanks for taking all my questions. And I know we all have a community in mind, and I'm glad we can all wrestle it out and debate these questions out and move forward. Thanks.
Appreciate it.
I will mention though, just so that it's in the air, OTF's backend, like the tech that they use to review applications and put comments and make it like very collaborative is open source. So just throwing that out there because the program's not perfect, but it's been customized just to review applications.
Awesome. I'll tell you what, I am a big fan of ending on time. I totally get the feeling that we could all keep having lots of great continued discussion. I'd like to wrap it up just by thanking everyone for coming. I think we are really nailing it or getting lucky at being able to have pretty in-depth conversations with a large number of folks in this community, and everyone's contributing so well and making such a good discussion. I think we've put on a lot of good inputs that the CAP will find very valuable in their Helios votes. I think we can wrap it up there. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Bye, guys.
Good night.
Have a good weekend. Bye.